Good morning or afternoon, everybody. It's TGIFS. Thank goodness it's FSMA Fridays. I would like to welcome you, and we're very excited about today's topic, the Food for Animals rule. You can see the very long name of the actual rule itself. We're going to shorten that up since we try to get you out of here in 30 minutes, and we're going to just move right along here. I'm Barbara Levin. I'm your host for today. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you've got technical issues, you can dial WebEx, who's hosting both the web and podcast portion of today's event. You can call them at 877-509-3239. By end of day Monday, everybody who's registered will receive a link to download the recording. If you are online with us today, you'll be able to submit your questions online at the end of the pre-submitted questions. And as always, for your privacy, you can see the names of the host and presenters for today and your name, but not the name of the other panelists. With that, we're always excited to welcome our FSMA Fridays team from the Atchison Group. Today, I think we have with us, of course, Dr. David Atchison, and David is being joined today by Jennifer McIntyre and Ann Sherrod. So welcome, David, Jennifer, and Ann. We're excited to have you with us and to discuss the animal rule, the animal food rule. And we're going to jump right in. And as we start every FSMA Friday with you, David, telling us the latest and greatest on FSMA. And I think we've got some hot off the presses latest and greatest this morning, huh?
Sure do, Barbara. No, it's good to be with you as usual. Yeah, the latest and greatest is literally in the last 15 minutes, the FDA has popped out the sanitary transportation proposed rule. This is what I think the agency is calling the seventh pillar in their FSMA, I don't know what to call it. It's a seven-pillared structure anyway. But I think they see this as the last and final pillar in the whole preventive control strategy. And no, I mean, I barely skimmed what this is about, but my 50,000-foot overview of this is, remember, this is not an authority that is a new one. It's an authority that was granted to FDA in 2005. And FSMA basically said, hey, guys, get on with writing the rule. And they have, and effectively, I think what this is going to focus on is its sanitary practices in transport. So it's going to be focused on refrigeration, time temperature controls, cleaning vehicles, and protecting food during transportation is essentially what this is about. I think one of the things that, and we'll be talking about this a lot more in the future, but one of the things that's already seeming to emerge from this is it looks like it is going to impact transportation of food intra-state, so within a state. Now, if I'm right on that, then this is going to be pretty impactful. But that's just on a very quick cursory look at this. Second news is that the agency has also just announced they're extending the comment period on the rule we're about to talk about. So it has been pushed out to the end of March for the proposed rule for food for animals. So it's just another little bit of hot off the press news. We're still cooking on FSMA, Barbara, and FSMA Fridays are going to run on for a long time yet. So hand back to you. Thanks.
This series is going to be ending anytime soon. And as always, we will adjust our schedule to get the latest and greatest in. We will get that sanitary transport rule. We'll give you more than 15 minutes for you and the team to read the rule. And when we send you the link to the recording, we'll let you know when we're going to schedule that. So with that, let's go on to the current good manufacturing practice and hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for food for animals rule, and see what that's all about. Ann, I'm going to start with you first. Welcome back to FSMA Fridays, and maybe you can kind of, give us a big picture of what companies are going to have to do, and maybe chat a little bit about how similar these requirements we think are going to be to the human food rules.
Sure, Barbara. Thanks. It's great to be back. I would say you summed it up in a mouthful with the actual title of the rule. So this proposed animal rule establishes new GMP provisions for animal producers for feed and food. The companies will have to implement those GMPs, and those GMPs are similar to the human rules, such as buildings and facilities, design and layout, cleaning and maintenance, and pest control. In addition to these new GMPs, facilities will have to develop food safety plans similar to the human rule as well. They will have to include a hazard analysis, and for those hazards that they deem as reasonably likely to occur in their particular facilities, they will have to develop appropriate preventive controls, and those preventive controls will be to significantly reduce or minimize or prevent those hazards from occurring. Similar to the human rule as well, facilities will have to monitor those preventive controls to ensure that they're consistently performed and develop corrective actions, and those corrective actions will need to be properly implemented, and in case that there's an unanticipated problem, you'll have to have a plan on how you would react to that as well. You will also be required to conduct forms of verification, validation of your preventive controls, verification that the monitoring of those preventive controls is being conducted, and also that you're conducting a reassessment of your food safety plan, and then if there's any corrective actions that you are doing, that you're following up on those as well from a verification perspective. And records, you just need to make sure that you're keeping the appropriate records. And I believe in this rule is similar to the human rule. There's a 2-year requirement for those records. Another one of those similarities or parallel of the human rule is that, differences is that it focuses on some elements that are a little bit different. The food safety of animal food, in turn, that are making it for food safety of animal food in turn of the animal health, the health of humans that are exposed to those animal foods, and then animal products that are derived for human consumption from those foods that are being produced under this particular rule. And that's about it for this question number 2.
A fair amount of similarities, actually, then between the preventive controls and some of the other rules that have come out. Jennifer, welcome back to FSMA Fridays. Let's go to you. So, who's going to have to comply with this rule? And I know that this seems like a silly question, but after speaking with you recently, it's really not. Can you give us the definition that, in terms of this rule, what is animal food, and maybe talk about if manufacturers of ingredients for livestock feed need to do anything differently than those producing food for our pets?
Sure, those are great questions. So first, the who needs to comply with this rule. This rule applies to FDA-registered facilities. Those are those facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold animal food. I'll get to that in the second half of my answer. There are some exceptions if a facility is producing a low-acid canned food. That low-acid canned food is exempt. If they are just holding food, packaged food, animal food, that doesn't require any sort of temperature control, they basically don't need to do all those things that Ann was talking about. If there is temperature control that's required for the finished food product, then again, similar to the human food, they just need to make sure that they're monitoring temperature. So the rule does apply to pretty much anybody else who has something to do with animal food and is an FDA-registered facility. Animal food as a term encompasses a few different types of foods. It's pet food, food for captive animals. It does include animal feed, and it includes the ingredients into those finished food products. So in terms of ingredients for livestock feed, pet food, they all will need to comply with this rule. And FDA really hasn't made a distinction between the ingredients versus finished food products, between if it's for animal feed versus pet food. They're all covered under this rule.
Very across the board then. Great, thank you. And let's go back to you. So how are current good manufacturing practices for animal food and feed different from those for human food?
First off, this establishes new good manufacturing practices for animal food and feed, which is different from the preventive controls for human, because that was enhancements and updates to current good manufacturing practices for human food. So first off, they're new for animal feed and food products. And Jennifer set the stage that all of those particular establishments that are required, those facilities that are required to be registered and do not meet an exemption to this rule, will need to implement good manufacturing practices. For example, hygienic practices, facility operations of maintenance and sanitation, good equipment and utensil design, and maintenance of those equipment, maintenance of that equipment, process controls, and warehousing and distribution, to name a few. Some of those good manufacturing practices that do not apply would be anything that may not be applicable to animals. And in this case, the difference would be the cross-contact of allergens. That is identified as something that is not a risk when producing pet food or animal feed, that it is for human production of food.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. Let's go back to you, Jennifer. What if a facility handles human food, but some of the waste goes to animal feed? And what happens when a human food company diverts to animal feed processing?
Great questions, and FDA did address this to some extent here, recognizing that a lot of companies, a lot of facilities that are manufacturing primarily human food or intend to manufacture human food, that there are those occasions when some of this food may be diverted to an animal stream. And so what then? And how do we deal with these very similar but in some way different sets of GMPs? And the answer that FDA gave to that was that for the GMPs, which I feel like I've always referred to as the human food GMPs, that FDA is considering food, when used there in Part 110, what's going to be Part 117, that food could mean human food or it could mean animal food. So that if you're a facility that is currently in compliance with Part 110 and will be in compliance with the new proposed 117, the update to 110, that you'd be all clear. If the food is produced under those conditions, it's food produced under GMPs, human or animal, you're all good. If you wanted to just use these new GMPs, the animal-specific GMPs, which as Ann highlighted are awfully similar to the ones already on the books for human food, a couple of minor differences. If you want to use those animal GMPs, you're fine too. Either way, so as a facility, you've got a kind of a choice, a little bit of flexibility there. There are, however, I think some kind of practical concerns and practical considerations when we look at human food, what was supposed to be human food that perhaps didn't meet the quality standard, and some instances where that food maybe isn't produced under human GMPs, but currently is deemed to be perfectly acceptable as animal food. Would it still be considered acceptable as animal food? And so I think that there are some gray areas here, perhaps cases that FDA hasn't fully considered, hasn't thought through, and that I would encourage industry to make FDA aware of, where things that have fallen on the floor, you know, can they just be scooped up and go into that bucket that's going to the animal stream? Would that be considered produced under GMPs or not? Whether it's the human GMPs or the animal GMPs, how is FDA going to view that? It's a question in my mind.
Yeah, okay.
This is Dave. I'm just going to add something to, because I think Jennifer has just raised what to me is a really important point that we need to be thinking about and maybe focusing on in terms of comment, because trying to establish good manufacturing practices around food, and particularly in this space of the human food going to animal feed, sort of the waste stream, which to a lot of food companies is actually valuable. I mean, it's got important economic consequences around it. And I'm sort of I'm struggling to get my head around how do you apply GMPs to, you know, a container of quote, human food waste going to animal feed, when ultimately that's going to get dumped in the back of a truck, driven to some farm, and then dumped over a wall into a pigsty or feeding cattle, which is like, you know, I mean, it couldn't be further from any sort of good GMP concept if you tried to get it further away. So I think we got some tough ones here, and we may end up applying some fairly stringent requirements on the industry with economic consequence, which is kind of just worthless in terms of actually protecting the health of the animals. And I think the focus here may be much more on chemical imbalance and physical contaminants than it should be on anything microbiological, just because the physiology of an animal gut is so different. And anyway, just a sort of editorial thought there.
No, and it makes a lot of sense because this could be quite impactful. And Jennifer, I know that you, you know, encouraged folks to, you know, to comment. Did I hear earlier that the comment period for this rule has been extended?
Yes, it has been extended. It's now extended till March 31st, which coincides with the deadline for comment for the intentional adulteration, the food defense proposed rule, which I know we'll talk about on our next FSMA Friday. So it gives people a little more time, a little more opportunity to think about some of these issues. And I and the rest of our team, we always encourage people to make comment, because if you don't raise these issues with FDA now, FDA won't have the information to address these in finalizing the rule. And certainly we would want some of these points to be clarified before the rule is finalized.
And that date happens to coincide with the I believe, opening day of Pet Food Forum. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about it then. We'll have a booth there, and we'll make sure that we have updates for anybody that wants to stop by. And let me come back to you here. You know, I think, you know, a year ago everybody thought FSMA seemed so far off. Well, you know, the comment periods are ending. It's quickly approaching, and, you know, we try to always tell companies, you know, what should you start doing today to prepare for this rule? Maybe you can give us some insight for the animal rule.
Sure, Barbara, and I think this is a great question too, and this is similar to all of the other proposed rules that makes notable changes around food safety proactivity in the industry. And this particular rule has those new GMPs that we spoke about. So not only is there the GMPs that people might want to start preparing for, but there's also the food safety plan and all that it entails that we spoke about earlier. So you want to start developing and training and implementing on these items so that when that final rule is out, you're not going to be on that really tight schedule to get all of these changes in, especially for this rule, by that effective date. And we're believing that effective date to be July 15th of 2015. So what should you be doing today? In my opinion, you make a plan. You identify and you dedicate those resources. You have to eat an elephant one bite at a time. You can't, you know, swallow it whole. So if you start developing your food safety plan, identifying those hazards, determining what preventative controls are going to reduce those hazards, how are you going to monitor it, you know, do those validations and appropriate verifications, make sure you have your corrective actions in place. You want to make the right decisions about those corrective actions. And then you want to make sure you're documenting everything, because, you know, in the world of regulatory, if you did not document it, you did not do it. And you want to make sure that you've got all of those things effectively taken care of so that you, ahead of time, so that you're not racing and trying to get everything fit into a tight time frame.
Words of wisdom. What we're going to do now is take questions from the audience. I'm going to take us out of full screen here. All of you now should be able to see on the lower right-hand side of your screen a Q&A tab, and you can put your question in the box in the lower right-hand side, and hit send, and I'm going to give you a little bit of additional information while we're waiting for some of those questions to queue up. Excuse me. So our next FSMA Friday schedule, you can see the schedule on the right here. We are going to add a date here, probably move a few things down and get to the sanitary rule. So you can always see this updated schedule on our website or at FSMAFridays.com, and we'll get you that date early next week. We've got some other great events coming up. We've got on February 14th, one of our favorite guest speakers, Dr. Tatiana Lorca with Ecolab, is going to talk about GFSI-approved vendor programs. And we're going to have a SafetyChain case study with Florida distillers, and where we can give cheers to a better way of managing FSQA, and you can register for those events on our website. So let's get to some of these questions. I've got one. David, maybe I'll start with you. Joseph is saying, on one of Ann's questions, she mentioned that there would be certain exemptions. Do you have any idea at this point, what kinds of, either processors or types of animal food might be exempt?
Yeah, there are exemptions, and Jennifer and Ann have touched on some of them. My read on the exemptions are that virtually everybody who's exempt from the actual components of the major part of the rule itself do need to comply with the GMP part. So there's very few people that are off the hook altogether unless, as per the human rule, you fall below the bar in terms of size of company. There's different requirements depending on what size you are, and whether you're holding grains and those types of things, which tend to sort of roll more into the exemptions. But there are exemptions, not as many as you might think, but and my read of it is that most folk are going to have to pay attention to the GMP part of this, even though they may be exempt from the actual need to do a kind of food safety plan for animal feed. But let me just see what Jennifer and Ann would add to that.
Yeah, thanks, David. This is Jennifer. To kind of add to what David said and what I had said earlier, the exemptions that exist are for that development of the food safety plan. FDA is clear that facilities, even if they're exempt from that requirement, would still need to comply with the proposed good manufacturing practices. There are some dollar cutoffs, which I neglected to mention. FDA is considering a range below which facilities wouldn't need to comply. That's between $500,000 and $2.5 million per year in annual sales. So recognizing that a lot of these facilities are larger facilities, that's why that threshold is a bit higher than the corresponding threshold on the human side. But as David said, I totally agree that this is something that if you think you might be covered, you probably want to pay close attention to it, because the exemptions, while there are some, are fairly limited.
Sure. Ann, let me ask you a question that was submitted by Jane. Jane is asking, does this rule apply only to food, or does it also apply to things like dietary supplements?
Well, if I'm answering the question correctly, this particular proposed rule that we're speaking about today applies to animal food and feed producers. There is also a human food preventive controls proposed rule. There is a new dietary ingredient rule that is part of FSMA as well, and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program has some references to dietary supplements as well. So that's FSMA as a whole. I'm not familiar, if I'm answering the question correctly, if there are any dietary supplement manufacturers that have waste streams that go to animal food or feed today. If that's the case, I would assume that that's probably going to be identified as a hazard because of fortification levels and different amounts of vitamins or minerals that might come from a dietary supplement that might go into a waste stream of an animal. I apologize if I did not get the question right. If there's anything else I can add to that, please let us know.
Okay, and anybody else? Because I think that there are dietary supplements that are packaged and sold in pet stores. Would these rules apply to those?
That's just what I was wondering, Barbara. Is dietary supplements for animals as a category? And Anne makes an interesting point. If you've got dietary supplement waste going into the animal stream, that's one thing, and I suspect that that's pretty minor, if any. But where do dietary supplements for animals fit? That's a really good question, and I don't know that I know the answer to that. My instincts are it doesn't fit in this. But then I'm not completely confident, because if we look at the definition of food, and I sort of just looking at it through the human lens, that would include dietary subs, hence the question. And food is food for humans and for animals. So it's a really good question. And I think we're going to have to research this one, unless Jennifer happens to know off the top of her head exactly the right answer.
I'm looking through the proposed rule now, and I don't see mention of this. And so it is not clear to
Well,
me.
Jane, good for Jane. We've given us all something to think about. We'll look into it, and we can email you an answer. And,
yeah, let's make sure that we answer. Let's make sure we answer this one on the next FSMA Friday, Barbara, because this
okay, we'll open that up.
This is a head scratcher for me, and I want to say it's not, but I want to be definitive.
I like it. We're gonna start next one with the regular update and the answer to this question. So I thank you, Jane. we'll come back to that one. Let's see, David. Deanna's asking, what risk is identified that this rule is fixing? Are there statistics on getting ill due to feed manufacturing? David, I hear you laughing. I knew you would thank me for giving that one to you.
Yeah, that's another head scratcher. Is okay. What are we trying to fix here? And my read of this is that what we're trying to fix is pet food, and it's like, well, where's that coming in? And historically, over the last 10 years or so, we've had a number of human outbreaks of illness linked to salmonella in pet food. There was a big one linked to Salmonella Septemberg a few years ago, and there's been several since. And my read of this is that is primarily what we're trying to fix here. And so the notion of producing food for animals, which includes pet food, as Jennifer and Anne have talked about, that needs to be manufactured using preventive controls and GMPs. That's a fix. Now, if you flip it the other way around and say, well, for livestock, what are we trying to do here? Then I'm struggling, because I am not aware of any situations that this rule would pertain to that would impact livestock. I mean, I totally understand that there are situations when livestock get sick from the food they eat. I don't know that this rule would impact that. Maybe to some small extent, but I came to the conclusion that this could just as easily have been a pet food rule, but maybe that was just pulling out one element of the animal feed industry unfairly, and everybody is sort of is wound up in the same space. But that's my instincts, is that's where we're going to get most bang for the buck out of this rule.
Barbara, are you there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Here I am. I was on mute. Jennifer, I'm going to come to this question from Kelly. Maybe you can look at it as well in the Q&A tab. It's a little long, and maybe you can look at it as well. So Kelly's saying the logic behind the feed rule is very similar to the food rules. FDA has indicated that they have a new way of thinking and will release new proposed food rules early summer 2014. How do you think this new thinking may impact the feed rule? I'm going to actually open that up to anybody.
Sure. I think that what's being referred to here is when the first rules came out, right around a year ago. It was the proposed preventive controls rule for human food and the produce safety rule. The comment period on both of those has closed. These were the first two rules that, showed any of FDA's hand around what they were thinking, and FDA got some substantial feedback on some of those rules. That's caused FDA to go back, not entirely to the drawing board, but to look at some aspects of both of those rules and rethink the approach. So FDA has said that come sometime this year, perhaps the summer, perhaps the fall, FDA is going to re-release a couple select sections of both of those rules, the proposed produce safety rule and the human preventive controls rule. FDA has indicated that some of these sections that are going to be put out there again for another round of public comment relate to the on-farm processing, the farm mix type facilities. On the produce side, there are a couple of topics that FDA wants to get another round of input on. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a couple of areas on the preventive controls for human side that are also addressed. Things that happened in the appendix before, like supplier verification, wasn't a requirement, wasn't proposed to be a requirement the first time the rule came out. I think this might be something that FDA addresses in the nearer term, perhaps some aspects of testing. And so this is what FDA is referring to when they talk about their new thinking. So the question was, to what extent could this impact this animal rule? Well, the animal rule came out more recently, of course, as FDA probably had already started hearing some of the comments, some of the feedback on the human rule. And so I'm not sure, by and large, that we'll see substantial changes, substantial modifications to the way really any of these rules are written. I think that we'll see clarification, we'll see maybe some additional sections on the human rule, but as each rule has come out, because they are so interrelated, they reference each other, they reference the other rules. So for example, in the food defense rule, there's talk about economically motivated adulteration, referring back to the preventive controls rule where it said on the human side, and in this animal one, we're not sure if economically motivated adulteration should be within scope. What do you think? Well, in the food defense rule, it says, we as FDA have thought about it a little more. We think it should be within scope in those other rules. So these are some of the sections that we may see revised in an interim state, but I don't see FDA doing an about-face in terms of the overall structure of any of these rules. And so perhaps that's a long-winded answer, and I would invite David and Ann to comment too if they see things differently. But I think those updates that are going to be made will be updates and will certainly be informative, but not alter the fundamentals of these rules.
Yeah, I think Jennifer's exactly right. I would add one other thought. And I think the question is getting at, will some of these updates apply to the proposed animal rule? And again, I would echo Jennifer's thoughts there that probably not many of them, if any. But the one that might is environmental monitoring. And I say that, again, back to my comment on the pet food and the notion that there's a component of the pet food industry where the food is ready to eat in terms of from a pet perspective. And we might expect environmental monitoring to sneak in there. And, I think the timing is interesting here because they probably, FDA, released this animal rule before they kind of closed the door on the human one, and certainly before they'd had any chance to really assimilate, look, and digest the comments. So I wouldn't be completely shocked if we don't see a few tweaks in the final animal rule that reflect some of this thinking around supply chain risk control and environmental monitoring. That wouldn't shock me, but I think it's much more probable in the human rule. That's for sure.
We have a couple more questions. Does everybody have a few more minutes? I think we can probably get through them pretty quickly. Anybody need to leave? Okay. And a question from Karen. Various seeds are packaged for feeding wild birds. Do all these regulations apply?
Wow, that's a really good question. I would say if in a review of the exemptions, that is how you would know. And also if it is a contained animal. So Jennifer had mentioned earlier that if the animals are contained, so you've got a bird in your home versus putting bird feed out on a tree for your local finches or cardinals or bluebirds. I believe that's an answer to your question, Jennifer. Would you have any other insight on that one?
Based on the way the rule is written, I would agree with you, but when you consider that one of FDA's concerns, as David mentioned, is the human exposure, and you mentioned it too, you know, it's not just the safety of the food for the sake of the animals consuming it, but also for the humans that are handling it, then humans could potentially be handling bird seed, throwing it outside, and then I'm not sure where that would fall. So the animal that's eating it may be outside the scope, but the fact that humans are touching it, I'm feeling very inadequate.
Another
today.
good one, right?
I'm proud.
You know, I'll jump on it. I'll jump in on this one, stick my neck out, and I think it's going to be in. And the reason I say that is I take us back to recalls of bird food. I'm actually just, while Ann and Jennifer were talking, I just did a quick Google, saves my life on a regular basis. And I found a recall of a bird food due to possible salmonella contamination. So I think bird food is going to be in, frankly.
Okay, we've heard it there. Let's see from Michael. Does the proposed rule offer examples of BMPs or CCPs for feedstuffs to be fed to livestock? There's an enormous amount of grain, hay, and byproducts for livestock feed. Who wants that?
This is Jennifer. I'll start. I'm not sure I can give a full answer, but I can give a partial answer. And when we're talking about grain, hay, one of the exemptions, I mentioned that this rule applies to facilities that are registered with FDA. One of the types of operations that is not required to register with FDA is farms. So if farms are growing their own products to feed to their animals, those food products are not covered by this rule. So in part, there's some dependency on where are these products coming from. Are they coming from farms, or are they coming from facilities that do need to be registered with FDA? There are also some low-risk activities, processing types of activities that are conducted on a farm. Some of these relate to the almond hulls, cotton seed, but again, those activities need to be conducted on a farm in order for them to be exempt. If they're conducted off a farm, our read is those same activities would not be exempt. In terms of examples of CCPs, it's up to the facility to determine what are the hazards and what are the appropriate controls. So FDA has not laid out some sort of template or checklist that you can follow. If I do this, then here's my control. It's up to the facility to determine that. But Ann or David, do you have any other comment?
No, I think you're right. And the key point here is where's the activity conducted. So as Jennifer says, some of these low-risk activities, if they're conducted on a farm, and that includes things like sorting and culling and grading grains and hay and the like, they're exempt, but they're not exempt from GMPs. So they are exempt from the preventive control rules. So remember, we've been saying all along that you may think you're off the hook, and you're off the hook for part of this in terms of the, quote, food safety plan, quote, close quote, but you do need to comply with the GMPs.
Okay. Well, I think that was our last question. And so we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today.
Barbara, can I interrupt you really quick?
Absolutely.
This is Ann. I did a little bit of background research on Jane's original question on dietary supplements, and I found something on the FDA's current animal and vet website which states that dietary supplements for animals are considered a feed supplement and would fall under the FD&C Act, would fall under FSMA. They do not fall under the Dietary Supplement and Health and Education Act of '94 for human food and do not need to comply with CFR 111. So we will do some more research, but it does look like from the current thinking on the FDA's website that these would be under the animal rule, considered a feed supplement or food for animals. But we'll dig deeper, but just wanted to share.
Well, we'll keep looking into that, but thanks for that update. Everybody, have a great day. Thanks for all the great questions. This was a lively one today, and we will see you on February 28th for our Food Defense FSMA Friday. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks, as always, to our team from the Atchison Group.